The call came in at 0217, and the ER was already bleeding. Not the patients, though there were plenty of those. No, it was the staffing board that had gone critical first. 2 residents out with flu, 1 attending stuck in surgery on a ruptured spleen that had taken 4 hours longer than anyone expected, and Dr. Fontaine, the chief of emergency medicine, the man whose name the hospital practically ran on, somewhere between Houston and Dallas on a highway that had flooded over. Sergeant First Class Brooke Calloway stood at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor of Morrow County Regional Medical Center and did what she always did when things started falling apart around her. She made a list. Not on paper, in her head. She had been doing it since Kandahar. The ER charge nurse, a heavyset woman named Darlene, was already on the phone with administration when Brooke came down from the 3rd floor to check on a patient transfer. The waiting room had 17 people in it. The ambulance bay doors kept opening and closing like a mouth that couldn't stop eating. "They're rerouting from Hendricks," Darlene said, pressing the phone against her shoulder. "Pile up on 94. Could be 8, could be 12. How many beds do we have?" Darlene gave her a look. The kind that meant, why are you asking questions you already know the answer to? 3, Brooke said. Got it. She pulled a fresh pair of gloves from the dispenser on the wall and headed toward the trauma bay. That was how the night started. Nobody knew who she was. That was the part that mattered. They knew her name, Brooke Calloway, RN, Level 2 trauma certification, transferred from Fort Bragg 18 months ago after a medical discharge nobody talked about. She kept to herself. She ate lunch alone when she ate at all. She wore her hair in the same low knot every shift, and she didn't make small talk, and she never ever talked about where she'd been before. The other nurses liked her well enough. You couldn't not like someone who showed up early and left late, and never called in sick, and never complained about the assignments nobody else wanted. But they didn't really know her. Dr. Fontaine's PA, a sharp-tongued man named Everett, had once said in the break room that Brooke Calloway moved through a trauma bay like she'd been manufactured for it. He meant it as a compliment. She didn't take it as one or any other way. She'd just nodded once and gone back to charting. The first ambulance arrived at 0231. Then the second 4 minutes later. Then the third and fourth came in together, which wasn't supposed to happen. And the doors to the trauma bay blew open like something had kicked them, and the world narrowed down to the next 30 seconds the way it always did when things went truly, completely wrong. Brooke was already at the first gurney before the paramedics had finished their handoff. Male, early 40s, blunt force thoracic trauma, BP dropping, oxygen sat at 84 and falling. His name, according to the bracelet they'd slapped on him at the scene, was Daniel Holt. He had a wedding ring and a haircut that said military, and his lips were going blue at the corners. "Someone get me a chest tray," Brooke said. "We need to wait for chest tray," she said again. Not loud, not angry, the same way you'd say pass the salt to someone who was already reaching for it. The tech got the tray. She was three steps into the assessment when the doors behind her opened again, and the temperature in the room changed. It wasn't the cold. Morrow County ER ran cold year-round, something about the HVAC system that had been broken since 2019 and was never getting fixed. No, this was a different kind of cold, the kind that came before someone with authority walked into a space they expected to own. Brooke didn't look up. "Where is Dr. Fontaine?" The voice belonged to Rear Admiral Warren Steck. She knew the voice before she turned around, and she did not turn around. She knew it from a briefing room in Bagram 3 years ago when it had said, "This investigation is closed. Sergeant Calloway's findings are not supported by the evidence." She knew it from a hallway in Bethesda when it had said, "Quieter," meant only for the man walking beside him. Make sure she doesn't talk to anyone. She kept her hands on the patient. "Dr. Fontaine is unavailable," said one of the ER techs, a young man named Phelan, who had only been on staff for 6 weeks and was clearly trying very hard not to visibly panic. "We have a nurse. I didn't ask about a nurse." Admiral Steck moved into the room like he owned the square footage. He was in civilian clothes, charcoal jacket, no tie, but he wore authority the way other men wore their skin, completely, unconsciously, as though it had never once occurred to him that it might not be his to wear. My aide is in critical condition. I was told this facility has trauma capabilities. It does, Brooke said. She still hadn't looked at him. She was reading the monitor. She was calculating. Then I want the physician in charge, Steck said. Now, there's no attending available in this bay. She peeled back the patient's shirt on the left side, found exactly what she'd suspected. A tension pneumothorax building, the kind that would stop his heart in minutes if nobody moved. She looked at Phelan. 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular. Do you have it? Phelan fumbled for the kit. Excuse me. Steck's voice had dropped a register. It was the voice men like him used when they wanted you to feel the floor shift under your feet. I am speaking to you. Brooke looked up. She turned, and she looked at him, and she let him see her face. For a half second, just half, something moved behind Warren Steck's eyes. A flicker. The kind that happens when a pattern you've filed away in the back of your mind suddenly matches something in front of you. He didn't know where he recognized her from. Not yet. Your aide has a tension pneumothorax, Brooke said. If I don't decompress his chest in the next 4 minutes, he will go into cardiac arrest. After that, you can talk to whoever you want. She turned back to the gurney. Phelan, needle. You are not a physician, Steck said. No, sir. Then you are not qualified to. I am a registered nurse with trauma certification, advanced cardiac life support, and 11 years of field surgical experience, including 2 deployments to active combat zones. She took the needle from Phelan's slightly shaking hand. You are welcome to find someone else. You have approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds to do that. Silence. The monitor beeped. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere beyond the bay doors, someone was crying. Do it, Steck said. She did it. The needle went in clean. The hiss of trapped air releasing was audible in the room, and the oxygen saturation began to climb back up the monitor in slow, steady increments. And Brooke was already moving to the next step before anyone in the room had fully exhaled. The aide, his name was Lieutenant Commander Garrett Niles, though she didn't learn that until later, needed a chest tube, and then fluids, and then close monitoring through the next 3 hours while his body decided whether it was going to hold together or come apart. Brooke stayed with him. She charted every vitals change. She noticed when his pressure dipped at 0318 and adjusted the drip herself and documented every single thing in handwriting that was precise enough to be mistaken for typed text. Admiral Steck stayed too. He stood against the wall with his arms folded and his jaw set, and he watched her work. She didn't acknowledge him. She'd had practice ignoring Warren Steck. She'd had 3 years of practice. At 0349, Garrett Niles' blood pressure stabilized. At 0351, he opened his eyes. He looked up at the lights and then at Brooke, and he said, hoarsely, "What happened?" "Pneumothorax," she said. "You're stable. Don't try to sit up." He blinked. "You're not." He stopped, swallowed. "You're the one who—" "Go back to sleep," she said. "We'll talk later." He did. Admiral Steck waited until she'd finished her documentation and moved toward the bay exit before he stepped into her path. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had spent 3 years making him smaller in her mind, and it hadn't worked the way she'd hoped. "Calloway," he said. She stopped. "Admiral, I didn't recognize you at first." "No, sir." He studied her face. She let him. She was good at being studied. She'd had practice at that, too. "You're working here," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man resorting information, rearranging files. "Yes, sir." "After your discharge?" "Yes, sir." Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't read it, and she had spent a great deal of her life being able to read people so that told her something. That whatever was happening behind Warren Steck's face right now was complicated enough that even he hadn't finished processing it yet. "My aide," he said. "He's going to be all right, barring complications. He'll need the tube for at least 48 hours, and I'd recommend an in-hospital cardiothoracic consult before he travels. But yes, he should be all right." Steck was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that felt like a room being straightened. Everything moved an inch to the left. "You should have been a doctor," he said. She looked at him. "I was told that once," she said, "by a physician in Kandahar who told me I had the steadiest hands he'd ever seen in an OR." She held his gaze. "That was 2 weeks before you shut down the investigation and had me discharged." The fluorescent lights kept humming. Calloway, my shift ends at 0600, she said. I'll make sure the attending physician has a full handoff on Lieutenant Commander Niles. She stepped around him. Good night, Admiral. She went back to the nursing station and finished her charting, and she did not think about Warren Steck, and she did not allow herself to feel anything that would take more than one night to put away. That was what she'd learned to do. In Kandahar, in the hallways of Bethesda, in the 18 months of quiet work in a county hospital where nobody knew her name or her history, and that was exactly the way she'd chosen it. Her brother, Thomas Calloway, was serving the second year of a 5-year federal sentence for conduct unbecoming and misappropriation of classified materials. He had been 24 years old when they arrested him. He had been the person who handed Brooke the files she'd used to build the investigation that Warren Steck buried. She had never told anyone that part. Not the JAG attorneys. Not the chaplain at Bethesda, who had sat with her for an hour after the discharge hearing and kept handing her tissues she didn't use. Not the one friend from her unit who still texted her on her birthday and pretended not to notice when she didn't write back for 3 days. She had kept it the way she kept everything. Inside, cataloged, filed under things that cannot be fixed right now. She drove home at 0612 in a 10-year-old Honda that needed new wiper blades, and she made coffee she didn't drink, and she sat at her kitchen table and did not sleep. 3 days later, Admiral Warren Steck came back to Morrow County Regional, not to the ER. He came to the administrative offices on the second floor, and he asked to speak to the director of nursing, a tired-looking woman named Harriet Pace, who had worked at the hospital for 22 years and took no enjoyment from surprises. Brooke was not in that meeting. She learned about it later, in pieces, from Darlene and from Phelan and from the administrative assistant who handled scheduling and could not keep a secret to save her life. What she gathered was this. Admiral Steck had spent 3 days. He had made phone calls. He had, apparently, asked someone he trusted, someone with no connection to the events of 3 years ago, to pull the original investigation file, not the official rec, the original. He had found things in it that should not have been buried. Brooke was in the break room eating a sandwich she'd brought from home when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She had a policy about unrecognized numbers that had served her well for years. She answered it, Sergeant Calloway. The voice on the other end was Warren Steck's, and it sounded different, not smaller, exactly. More like a man choosing his words with the care of someone who knows they only get to say them once. I'd like to meet with you. Off the record. She took a bite of her sandwich. I'm not a sergeant anymore, Admiral. No, he said. I know. A beat. I'll hear what you have to say, she said. That's all I'm promising. They met at a coffee shop 2 miles from the hospital, at 1400 on a Tuesday, in a booth near the back where nobody would walk past them. Steck was in civilian clothes again. And he looked, she thought, like a man who hadn't slept much either. He put a folder on the table between them. She looked at it. She did not reach for it. I had someone I trust go back through the original investigation, he said. The full file, not the redacted version that went into the official record. He paused. What I found. Another pause. Long. Calloway, I made a decision 3 years ago based on information I was given by people I trusted. I am now aware that that information was incomplete. Deliberately so. She waited. The communications logs, he said. The ones your brother was accused of misappropriating. He pushed the folder an inch closer to her side of the table. They weren't stolen. They were copied and forwarded through an internal channel that was being used by a senior officer out in my command to cover a contracting fraud that would have implicated 3 people above my own pay grade. She said nothing. Your brother didn't take those files to hurt anyone, Steck said. He took them because you asked him to, and you asked him to because you'd found something that someone didn't want found. He looked at her. I know that now. The coffee shop hummed around them. Someone at the counter was ordering something with a complicated name. A child at another table was drawing on a paper placemat with crayons. Thomas has been in federal prison for 2 years, Brooke said. I know. He was 24 years old. I know. Steck's jaw was tight. What I'm telling you is that the documentation to support a review of his case exists. I've already been in contact with the Army JAG office. There is a process, she said. It won't be fast, he said. I want to be honest with you about that. These things are never fast. But it is real. It can happen. He held her gaze. I can make sure it happens. She looked at the folder. She thought about Thomas at 24, calling her from a borrowed cell phone in a processing facility in Virginia, and the way his voice had been so careful and steady, the same way hers went careful and steady when everything was going wrong. Because they had learned it from the same place, from their father who had worked 30 years as a county sheriff and never once lost his composure in front of either of them. She thought about a trauma bay at 0231 in the morning, with a man's oxygen saturation at 84 and falling, and the way her hands had not shaken, and the way they never shook anymore. Why are you doing this? She asked. Steck was quiet for a moment. Because I sat against a wall in your ER for 3 hours and I watched you work, he said. And I watched you make a decision, the correct decision, under pressure, with incomplete resources and a hostile audience. And I thought about the decision I made 3 years ago. Under considerably better conditions, he looked down at the table. I made the wrong call. I was given bad information, but I also didn't ask the right questions. That's on me. She studied him. She had spent 3 years keeping Warren Steck filed under a very specific category in her mind. The category did not have a charitable name. She was not going to rearrange that filing in the space of a Tuesday afternoon in a coffee shop. But she was also not going to be stupid about what was in front of her. I want it in writing, she said. Everything you just told me, the contracting fraud, the name of the officer who manipulated the file, the process for Thomas's review, all of it. She folded her hands on the table. And I want an independent JAG attorney, someone I choose, copied on everything from this point forward. Steck nodded once. Done. And if this stalls, she said, or if anything about this starts to feel like it's being managed back into a drawer somewhere, I still have the original files your officer was trying to bury. Copies. In more than one location. He looked at her for a long moment. I believe you, he said. She reached across the table and picked up the folder. It took 7 months. That was the part nobody tells you about when they talk about justice. How long it actually takes. How many forms and hearings and procedural delays it moves through. How many times a phone call doesn't come when it was supposed to. And you have to sit with that silence and not let it mean anything yet. Brooke worked her shifts. She drove her Honda with the bad wiper blades. She ate her lunches mostly alone, though sometimes Phelan sat with her, and he'd started bringing interesting things to eat and showing them to her, like a person demonstrating magic tricks, waiting to see if she'd react, and occasionally she did. She called Thomas every week through the prison's phone system. She told him there was something in progress. She did not tell him more than that because she had learned a long time ago that hope was a thing that could injure people if you handed it to them too early. He told her about the other men in his unit, about the GED classes he'd been teaching on Tuesday afternoons, about a book someone had left in the common area that he'd read 3 times. She told him about Phelan's food experiments and about a patient she'd had who had been 91 years old and had held her hand during a procedure and told her, very seriously, that she reminded him of his daughter and how she hadn't known what to do with that, so she just held on. In the 4th month, the name of the officer who had manipulated the files became part of the official record. He was a colonel named Baxter Dowd, and he had been moving money through defense contracting accounts for 6 years. And he had used 3 different people to carry pieces of information he needed buried, and Thomas Calloway had been the easiest target of the 3 because he was the youngest and the least connected, and nobody had looked very hard at whether the story made sense. In the 6th month, the formal review board convened. Brooke was not in the room. Family was not permitted at that stage. She sat in a parking lot in her Honda with the radio off and did the breathing exercise she'd learned from a combat stress counselor in 2019, the one she'd told herself at the time was probably useless, the one she'd been using ever since. Her phone rang at 15:37. It was the JAG attorney she'd chosen, a woman named Sargent, first-class Eugenia Tart, who had been practicing military law for 15 years and who communicated primarily in short declarative sentences, which Brooke appreciated. The review board voted in favor of relief, Tart said. Sentence commuted. Full discharge review to follow. It won't be immediate. He'll need to complete the administrative process, probably 4 to 6 weeks. But it's done, Brooke. It's done. Brooke sat in the parking lot for a long time. She did not cry. She had not been able to cry, not easily, not since a night in Kandahar in 2021, when she'd held a 22-year-old corporal's hand while he died of injuries that should not have been fatal but were, because of decisions made 30 levels above his head by people who would never know his name. Something had gone quiet in her after that. Not broken. Just rearranged. But she sat in the parking lot, and she breathed, and she let the information move through her the way water moves through ground, slowly finding every space, filling every dry and waiting place. Thomas came home 6 weeks and 3 days later. He was 26 by then, and he was thinner than she remembered, and there was something behind his eyes that was different, more careful, more layered, the way a person gets when they've had to live very close to their own thoughts for a long time. She recognized it. She'd seen it in the mirror. They met in the parking lot of the bus station in Crestwood, because that was where he came in, and she was standing next to her Honda with her hands in her jacket pockets when he came through the doors. He stopped. When he saw her, she said, "I brought coffee. It's from a gas station, so don't get excited." He laughed. It was the same laugh. That was the part that undid her a little, that his laugh was exactly the same, that 2 years in a federal facility and everything that happened between then and now had not managed to get to his laugh. "Gas station coffee," he said. "Very classy. I know your standards," she said. He crossed the parking lot and she handed him the cup, and they stood there for a minute in the cold morning air and didn't say anything, because they didn't need to yet. "You didn't tell me how close it was," he said finally. "When you were calling every week, you kept saying there's something in progress like it was a home renovation. I didn't want you to. I know." He looked at her. "I know why. I'm not complaining." He paused. "Steck really did it? He actually pushed it through?" "He did. Why?" She thought about the trauma bay at 0231, the sound of the monitor climbing back up. The way Steck had stood against the wall with his arms folded, watching her hands. "I think," she said slowly, "that he needed to see something clearly before he could do the right thing. And I think he got lucky that it happened in an ER at 2 a.m. instead of somewhere without a second chance." Thomas was quiet. "You saved his aide's life," he said. "I did my job. You saved the life of the aide of the man who destroyed yours." "He didn't destroy it," she said. She meant it. That was the part that still surprised her sometimes. That she meant it. She was standing in a parking lot in Crestwood handing terrible coffee to her brother. And she had a job she was good at, and a Honda with bad wiper blades, and a tentative new friendship with a nurse tech who brought creative lunches. And none of that was nothing. None of that was a destroyed life. He redirected it, she said. "There's a difference." Thomas looked at her the way he used to look at her when they were kids, and she said something he needed time to think about. Then he raised the gas station coffee cup, and she raised hers. "To redirection," he said. She touched her cup to his. 3 months later, Admiral Warren Steck sent a letter to Morrow County Regional Medical Center. It was addressed to the director of nursing, and it was professionally written and appropriately formal, and it commended the exceptional care provided by the emergency nursing staff on the night of the accident on Route 94. It mentioned Brooke Calloway by name. Dr. Harriet Pace brought it to Brooke on a Tuesday morning during a slow hour between shifts, and she handed it to her without saying anything, and Brooke read it standing at the nurse's station in the same low knot she always wore her hair in. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and handed it back to Pace. "I'll add it to your file," Pace said. "You don't have to," Brooke said. "I want to," Pace said, and went back to her office. Brooke put on a fresh pair of gloves and went back to work. The waiting room had 11 people in it. The ambulance bay doors were quiet for now. Somewhere in the building, a monitor beeped in its steady, patient rhythm. The sound of a body holding on, of numbers, climbing back toward the range where they needed to be. She had always loved that sound, not because it meant everything was fine. It never meant everything was fine. It meant something was being held together by skill and attention, and the refusal to stop, and that was the closest thing to a miracle she'd ever believed in. She pulled the next chart. She got to work.